The sound of the ocean crashed beneath me, waves colliding against jagged rocks, as if the sea itself was hungry for blood. I remember the salt stinging my nostrils, the icy wind clawing at my skin, and the hand of the man who was supposed to protect me tightening against my shoulder. My stepfather Richard leaned in his breath, sour, his voice low but laced with venom. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he wanted to share some kind of secret or apology, something almost human. But the glint in his eye was not regret. It was hunger. Then it happened. In one brutal shove, his palm slammed into my chest, sending me backward into nothing but air. My scream was ripped away by the wind. The cliff vanished beneath me. Gravity claimed me like an executioner. I hit the rocks once, twice before I managed to grab at something, anything, and felt my fingers tear into a thick root protruding from the cliffside. Pain exploded through my arm, my nails bent backward, skin splitting, but I clung to that root like it was the last vein of life keeping me tethered to this world. Above me, his shadow leaned over the cliff, and then his voice triumphant, guttural, booming across the shore. "It's all ours now." His words weren't just cruel, they were a confession. They burned themselves into my mind with the clarity of fire on dry wood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment rage. This was a plan, a declaration that I had just been erased, that my father's inheritance, my legacy, my life had been claimed by a man who had no right to it. I dangled their blood dripping from my chin, salt burning my wounds, the rocks below, eager to swallow me whole. The cold water looked like black glass waiting to break me into pieces. My arms screamed for release. My chest heaved. My legs scraped against the cliff wall, torn open by stone. And then, something inside me, something that had been buried for years beneath his gaslighting and my mother's silence, clawed its way to the surface. No, not like this. Not this time. With every ounce of strength left in my battered body, I began to crawl. My hands dug into the dirt, my knees shredded against stone. Inch by inch, breath by agonized breath, I pulled myself up. I felt the root snap behind me, heard the echo of it breaking, but my fingers latched onto another ledge and then another. My lungs screamed, but I kept going. I refused to die the way he wanted me to. I refused to give him that victory. When I finally reached the top, gasping face smeared with blood and grit, Richard was gone. But his words still poisoned the air. "It's all ours now." I wiped the blood from my lip, pushed myself onto trembling legs, and whispered to myself, to the wind, to the memory of my real father. "You think it's yours? Watch me." That was the moment I stopped being his victim. That was the moment I decided to fight. When people hear that a young woman's stepfather tried to kill her for money, they often imagine the warning signs must have been obvious, like neon lights flashing danger, but the truth is more insidious. It starts small. It starts with whispers, with gaslighting, with years of conditioning, so that by the time the violence comes, you almost believe you deserved it. My name is Clara Henderson, and I grew up in a house where silence was currency and survival meant swallowing your words. My real father died when I was 10, a sudden heart attack that ripped the ground out from under me. He had been everything, the one person who believed in me, who encouraged me to draw, to sing, to dream. His death was not only a heartbreak, it was the opening that let Richard in. My mother Evelyn remarried within 2 years, claiming she needed stability, a partner, someone to help raise me. What she never said was that she needed someone to take the financial burden off her shoulders. My father had left behind a modest inheritance, a house on the coast, and some land that had been in his family for generations. That property was supposed to be my safety net, my future, a legacy to protect me. But from the day Richard moved in, I understood that legacy had a target on it. He was a man who wore charm like a mask. To outsiders, he was funny, charismatic, even generous. To me, he was a storm that never ended. At first, it was words, cutting ones delivered in casual tones. "You think you're special, Clara? You think that land belongs to you? You're just a child. What do you know? I was 15 when he shoved me the first time, a hard push against the wall, because I talked back. My mother scolded me after. Not him saying, "Do not provoke him, Clara. You know he has a temper." That is how it went year after year, his cruelty framed as my fault, his control reframed as love. He would say things like, "I only shout because I care. I only lock your phone because I want you safe. I only hit you because you need discipline. And my mother, Evelyn." She nodded along her silence, more violent than his fists. Gaslighting became the air I breathed. I remember once showing her bruises on my arm, purple fingerprints that looked like shadows clinging to my skin. She pressed her lips together, eyes darting away, and said, "Clara, stop exaggerating, you bruise easily, you know that." I wanted to scream to shake her, but instead I swallowed it because somewhere inside me a voice whispered, "Maybe she's right, maybe I am too dramatic." That is what gaslighting does. It rewires you until you cannot trust your own pain. But beneath all that silence, there was always the knowledge of my father's inheritance, the deed papers with my name on them once I turned 30. Richard knew it. He studied the documents like a hunter stalks prey. He hated that my father had thought ahead, had tied everything legally to me. From the time I was 18, he would remind me, "You're nothing without us. That property isn't really yours. When you turn 30, we'll see what's left of you." He said it like a joke, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable. I tried to escape. I applied for colleges far away, begged for scholarships, but every attempt was sabotaged. Applications went missing forms, unsigned fees, mysteriously unpaid. My mother claimed it was fate. Richard smirked and said, "You don't need school, you need family." And when I dared to argue, his fist met the table, the walls shook, and I learned to shrink again. By the time I reached 25, my spirit felt like a house, half burned, standing, but charred windows blackened. I worked odd jobs, saved scraps of money, dreamed of leaving, but never quite made it. Friends told me I looked haunted. I brushed it off. But inside, I knew I was living with my predator. The closer I crept to 30, the more volatile Richard became. He accused me of spying, of planning to steal what was rightfully his. He called me a snake, a thief, a liar. And Evelyn, my mother, never once said, "Stop." She only repeated the old line, "Family business stays in the family. Do not shame us." When the letter arrived from the lawyer confirming that my inheritance would pass to me untouched on my 30th birthday, Richard's mask slipped completely. I found him one night at the kitchen table, the letter crumpled in his fist, his eyes glowing with a kind of rage that chilled my bones. He slammed the paper down and snarled, "You think this means you've won. You think you'll get to take everything and leave us with nothing. I will never let that happen." That was the night I knew he was planning something. He grew strangely calm in the weeks after planning a family trip, smiling too wide, insisting we needed bonding time. Evelyn played along, acting as if nothing was wrong, but I could feel the tension vibrating beneath their words. And when Richard suggested a day by the cliffs, a scenic walk along the ocean where my father used to take me as a child, my stomach dropped. I knew it was not a family outing. It was an ambush. What I did not know then was how far he would go, how close I would come to death, and how much fire would be forced out of me in order to survive. The days leading up to the trip felt like living inside the mouth of a predator, the air thick with anticipation, the silence too deliberate. Richard began wearing politeness like a well-pressed suit, offering me coffee in the mornings, asking about my work as if he cared. But beneath the surface, his eyes glimmered with a sharpness that never softened. My mother, Evelyn, followed his lead, her tone unusually sweet, her hands fidgeting whenever she thought I was not looking. They had made a decision, I could feel it, but they thought they were clever enough to hide it. They did not know that years of abuse had made me hyper-aware, able to smell danger before it arrived. The letter from the lawyer had shifted something permanently in Richard. For months before it he had threatened, belittled, occasionally lashed out. After the letter there was calculation. I once overheard him muttering in the garage while pretending to fix his tools. "She will not take it, not from me, never." Evelyn's voice answered softly, almost soothing. "We have to be careful. People will ask questions." Richard barked back, "There will be nothing to ask when she is gone." I remember my blood freezing my back pressed against the wall, listening to my own heartbeat thunder in my ears. In that moment, I realized what I had always suspected was true. They were not just cruel, they were plotting. When he suggested the family trip, his tone was drenched in false warmth. "It will be good for us, Clara. We need to reconnect, see the places your father loved." The hypocrisy nearly made me choke. Evelyn chimed in, her voice brittle but insistent. "Yes, darling, it will heal old wounds. Heal." That was the word she used, as if luring me toward the very place my father had cherished, only to stain it with betrayal. The preparation for the trip was filled with small details that gnawed at me. Richard insisted on packing the bags himself. He checked my shoes, said he wanted to make sure they had good grip for the cliffs. His tone was mockery disguised as concern. At dinner the night before we left, he raised a glass of wine and toasted to family, to new beginnings, to what is rightfully ours. Evelyn clinked her glass against his, her eyes avoiding mine. Her lips stretched into a smile that looked more like a grimace. I felt like an actor trapped in a play where the ending had already been written. The morning we left, I felt the weight of dread settle into my chest like an anchor. The cliffs were a place my father had loved, a place where we had walked together when I was a child, where he would point out the horizon and say, "Clara, the world is bigger than your fears." Returning there with Richard felt like spitting on his memory. As we drove, Richard hummed tunelessly, tapping the steering wheel. Evelyn sat stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I stared out the window, memorizing the road, the trees, the sea glittering in the distance. Every instinct screamed at me to jump from the car, to run. But fear is a heavy chain, and part of me needed proof, needed to see his mask break so I could finally irrevocably stop doubting myself. When we arrived, the ocean roared beneath the cliffs. Gulls screamed overhead, the sky stretched wide and merciless. Richard's smile was wide, his hand gripping my shoulder with too much force. "Isn't it beautiful, Clara?" he said, like a father sharing wisdom. Evelyn's eyes darted between us, her face pale. She was complicit, but terrified, a coward who had chosen her loyalty and sealed my fate. We walked along the edge, the wind tugging at my clothes, the waves smashing against the rocks below. Richard began to talk about the property again, his words sharp despite the calm tone. "Do you realize how much responsibility that land carries? Clara, do you know what it means to manage it? It is not for you. You cannot handle it. You never could." I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up, but drowned by the fear of what was coming. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "That land belongs to me. It always has. Your father was a fool for leaving it to you." His fingers dug into my arm nails, biting my skin. I wanted to scream, to shove him away, but my mother's voice cut in like a ghostly echo. "Stop arguing, Clara, just listen to him." Her complicity burned worse than his grip. Then Richard smiled wide and cruel, and I knew. This was it. His hand pushed against my back, firm, deliberate. My body lurched forward, the edge of the cliff yawning open before me. I scrambled my shoes, sliding against loose gravel, my arms flailing. He held me steady for a second, like a mockery of protection, then whispered in my ear, "You do not deserve any of it." And with one violent thrust he shoved. The world tilted, the sky spun, the ground vanished. My scream was ripped away by the wind as I fell. In that fraction of a second, I saw his face above me, calm, satisfied, certain he had won. I hit the cliffside pane, exploding across my ribs, blood filling my mouth. My fingers clawed desperately until they found that root, the one that would save me. Dangling there, broken and bleeding, I heard his voice echo down triumphant and vile. "It is all ours now." He believed I was gone. He believed his plan was flawless. But what he did not know was that someone else had seen. Just beyond the trail hidden by rocks, Mark, my childhood friend, had come to walk the cliffs alone, a habit he had kept since his father died. His phone had been in his hand, recording the ocean when the crime unfolded before his eyes. His video captured it all, the shove, the scream, the words that condemned Richard forever. At that moment, I was only fighting to stay alive, unaware that the truth had finally been caught, that justice had been handed to me in the form of a shaky recording and a witness who would not stay silent. The moment his hands left my back and the empty air swallowed me, I knew he had never intended for me to survive. It was not rage. It was not impulse. It was execution. The fall tore through me like knives. My shoulder cracked against stone, my leg scraped open, warm blood soaking my jeans, and when I latched onto that root, my fingers screamed with agony as splinters tore under my nails. The ocean below was black churning, waiting, and the rocks glistened sharp as blades. Richard's voice thundered down like a curse. It is all ours now, his triumph echoing across the cliffs. My grip faltered. My breath came in broken sobs. And for a heartbeat, I wondered if maybe it would be easier to let go, to fall, to disappear the way he wanted. But then I saw my father's face in memory, the way he used to tell me, "Clara, you are stronger than you think," and something inside me clawed to life. With everything shredded and broken, I pulled inch by inch, my knees scraping raw, my shoulders straining until I thought they would snap. The root cracked behind me, but my hand found another ledge, a jagged edge that tore my palm open. Blood slicked my grip, but I refused to release. The climb was a war between gravity and defiance, between Richard's voice in my head telling me you are worthless and my own voice whispering not anymore. When at last my body rolled onto the dirt above, gasping, retching, my face pressed to the earth, Richard was gone. My mother stood a few paces away, her face white as chalk, her eyes wide, frozen between horror and loyalty. She whispered, "Clara, you should not have fought," her voice trembling as if I had done something wrong by surviving. Rage surged through me, hotter than the blood dripping down my chin. She turned quickly and followed Richard back toward the car, leaving me trembling, broken but alive. I spat blood onto the ground and swore I would not let them win. Every step back to the house was agony. My body screamed with pain. My ribs ached, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I replayed his words again and again. It is all ours now. The confession of a greedy man who thought murder could be covered up as an accident. When I stumbled into the small coastal road leading back to town, I nearly collapsed, but a voice called my name. Mark ran toward me, his face pale, his phone clutched tight in his hand. "I saw you," he gasped. "I saw everything. I recorded it, Clara. I have proof." My knees gave out and he caught me before I hit the ground. In that moment, the pain dulled beneath the surge of something else, something close to hope. For years, I had been silenced, gaslit, told I was dramatic, told to stay quiet for the family. But now, the truth was on video, undeniable, permanent. As Mark half-carried me back to his truck, I could still hear the ocean pounding below the place where I was supposed to die. My blood smeared against the seat as he laid me down, his hands shaking as he tried to call emergency services. "Stay with me, Clara," he kept saying. "You cannot close your eyes, not yet." I drifted in and out, each breath a knife in my chest, but through the haze I clung to the sound of his voice and the knowledge that Richard had made one fatal mistake. He had believed no one would ever see. When the ambulance arrived, lights flashing against the twilight, my mother and Richard were already spinning their story. She slipped into the hospital room hours later, her face tight, her words rehearsed. "Clara, it was an accident. You lost your footing. You must tell them that." My laugh was bitter and cracked blood still staining my lips. "Accident," I rasped. "Is that what you call attempted murder?" I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way her mask almost broke, but then she pressed her lips together and said firmly, "Family business stays in the family. You do not want to embarrass us." Embarrass. As if nearly being killed was a performance mistake, as if my survival was an inconvenience. My fury burned hotter than the morphine dripping into my veins. I told her, "Get out!" For the first time, my voice did not shake. Later, as doctors stitched my wounds and the police took notes, Mark handed over his phone. The shaky video played on the screen, showing Richard's hands my scream, the words that damned him forever. Better than any testimony, better than any plea, it was the raw truth. The officer looked at me, then back at the screen, his jaw tightening. "We will take it from here." In the sterile hospital room, pain radiating through every nerve, I realized that Richard's attempt to silence me had unleashed something unstoppable. He had created his own destruction. The immediate aftermath was not relief, it was rage turned into fuel. They had pushed me too far, and now there would be no more silence, no more secrets, no more family loyalty twisted into a weapon against me. From the moment I pulled myself back from the cliff's edge, the war had shifted. Richard thought he had won, but he had just set the stage for his downfall, and for once in my life I held the power to make sure he paid. Lying in that hospital bed with stitches pulling at my skin and every breath like a blade in my chest, I thought about how many times Richard's voice had echoed in my life, telling me I was worthless. How many times Evelyn had looked away, and how many nights I had stared at the ceiling, convincing myself to endure just one more day. Now his words, "It is all ours," now looped in my head like poison, and it was impossible not to see the connection between this moment and the countless times they had tried to erase me long before the cliff. Memories came back in jagged flashes like shards of glass cutting their way through the fog of morphine. I was 11. Richard newly in our home, telling me not to bother asking questions at the dinner table because no one wanted to hear my voice. I was 13, Evelyn standing by the doorway while he ripped up my sketchbook, the one thing my father had encouraged, telling me art was a waste of time. I was 15, the sting of his hand across my face after I told him I wanted to apply to a school 2 states away. His sneer as he told me, "Don't embarrass us, Clara." I was 17, watching my mother's eyes as she told me, "You need to understand, Richard provides for us, so you must listen." Her silence a betrayal sharper than any slap. And now I was 29, the culmination of every wound, nearly killed for daring to exist, for daring to hold on to what my father had left me. The memories churned together with the present until they became unbearable. But then Mark entered the room again, his phone clutched in his hand, his face pale but determined. "Clara, you need to see this," he said, and though my body screamed to rest, I forced my eyes open. The video played shaky but clear. It showed Richard's body looming over me, the sudden shove, my arms flailing, my scream ripped into the wind, then his triumphant shout, "It's all ours now." The clarity of his voice on the recording made my stomach twist. It was undeniable. Not just a suspicion, not just my word against his. Proof. Years of gaslighting and denial shattered in a few seconds of footage. For once, the monster was caught in his own act. Tears burned my eyes, but they were not tears of despair. They were the raw release of knowing that I had not been crazy, that I had not imagined the cruelty, that the truth was finally carved into something permanent. Mark's hand was trembling as he held the phone, but his voice was steady. "We have to take this to the police. They can't ignore it." I nodded, weak but resolute. For years, I had been told family business stays in the family, that silence was safety, but silence had nearly killed me. Now silence would kill justice, and I refused to let that happen. As the officers returned, Mark handed them the phone. They watched their faces tightening, one of them muttering "Jesus Christ" under his breath. They replayed it, leaned in, listened to every word. When they left the room, their eyes met mine with a kind of respect I had not seen in years. "We'll take care of it," one of them said. Later that night, alone again in the sterile room, I thought about Evelyn. Her pale face when she told me to call it an accident. Her refusal to acknowledge my bruises years before. Her choice to stand beside the man who tried to kill her daughter, rather than the daughter who had begged for protection. The betrayal was not just Richard's shove, it was every silent nod of hers, every closed mouth, every refusal to look me in the eye when I needed her most. I remembered being 8 years old, running into her arms after a nightmare, and her promising she would always protect me. That promise had died long before my father, long before the cliff. The truth exposed by the video was not just Richard's guilt, it was Evelyn's complicity. The next morning, detectives arrived with more questions. I told them everything. I told them about the bruises, the threats, the overheard conversations in the garage. I told them about Evelyn's words, family business, stays in the family. The detective scribbled notes, nodding his eyes, darkening with each detail. "You've lived through hell," he said quietly, "but now it's time they face consequences." Those words were almost unbelievable to me. For so long, authority had been something Richard manipulated, a force that ignored me. But now authority was finally leaning toward justice. Still, even as hope flickered, fear gnawed at me. Richard was not a man who gave up easily. If he realized the video existed, if he understood his empire of lies was collapsing, what would he do next? My body ached, but my mind was sharper than ever. This was no longer about survival. It was about war. For years, Evelyn and Richard had controlled the narrative. I was dramatic. I was unstable. I was ungrateful. That narrative had protected them while I suffered. But now, with one recording, that story was cracked wide open. The truth was on my side finally, and I was ready to wield it. As I stared at the hospital ceiling, oxygen burning through my lungs, I whispered to myself, not this time. They wanted me dead. Instead, they had handed me the weapon to destroy them. The first time I walked into the courthouse, I could feel my father's presence like a steady hand at my back and Richard's absence like a weight I wanted to crush. My body still bore the marks of his violence. My ribs tender, my palms scarred, but every step across the marble floor was defiance. Evelyn sat on the other side of the aisle, her eyes darting anywhere but toward me, her lips tight, as if she could still control the narrative with silence. Richard entered in handcuffs, his head held high, that smug smirk plastered across his face, as if this was just another performance he was certain he could manipulate. He scanned the courtroom, his eyes locking on me with a flash of fury, then flicking to the jury with false humility the mask he had worn my entire life. But what he did not understand was that the mask had already been ripped away. The prosecution wasted no time. They dimmed the lights, projected the shaky video onto the screen, and in an instant his crime filled the room. The grainy image showed him walking with me along the cliff, his hand suddenly shoving me into the air, my scream tearing through the audio, and then his voice loud, cruel, undeniable. "It is all ours now." Gasps spread like wildfire through the courtroom, people leaning forward, jaws slack, whispers rippling like waves. Some clutched their chests, others shook their heads. The jury froze, their expressions hardening with each replay. There was no misinterpretation, no excuse, no accident to hide behind. The truth was seared into every corner of that room. Richard's smirk faltered, his jaw clenched, but he tried to recover, tried to summon his charm. He shook his head as if the video were some kind of illusion. His lawyer sputtered about context, about editing, but the words fell flat against the raw evidence of the recording. I watched Richard for once stripped of power, his eyes flicking wildly, his hands tightening around the table until his knuckles whitened. Evelyn was called to testify. She walked slowly to the stand, her shoulders hunched, her face pale. The prosecutor asked simple questions. Did she see Richard push me? Did she hear his words? Did she try to stop him? Evelyn stammered, her voice cracking, claiming she did not remember, claiming it was all too sudden, claiming I had slipped. But then the prosecutor played the video again, the screen glowing behind her, her face visible in the corner of the frame, frozen. Watching, doing nothing. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Evelyn trembled, tears welling in her eyes, but the truth was undeniable. She had chosen loyalty to her husband over her daughter's life, and now the whole world could see it. When it was my turn to take the stand, my legs shook. My throat tightened, but I forced myself forward. For years I had been silenced. Now I would speak. I told them about the bruises, the gaslighting, the threats. I told them about the side I overheard him planning about Evelyn's words, family business stays in the family. I told them how I fell, how the rocks tore at my body, how his voice echoed down as if celebrating a victory. And then I told them about the climb, the refusal to die the moment I decided I would no longer live in fear. My voice grew steadier with every word, and when I finished, the jury's eyes were locked on me, their faces heavy with empathy, with outrage. Richard's attorney tried to paint me as dramatic, unstable, hungry for sympathy, but every attempt crumbled beneath the weight of the video. Every word he threw at me bounced off the shield of truth I finally held. The climax of the trial came when the judge leaned forward, his voice stern, deliberate. "We are not here to speculate. We are here to weigh facts, and the facts are plain." This was an attempted murder born of greed carried out without remorse. His gavel struck like thunder, and the sentence rang through the room: 20 years in prison for Richard Henderson with charges of attempted murder fraud and domestic abuse. Evelyn's fate was softer, but still damning. She was convicted of aiding and abetting, given a suspended sentence, but the court of public opinion was far harsher. Neighbors whispered, friends vanished, her reputation crumbled. She left the courthouse that day smaller, diminished, a woman stripped of the facade she had clung to. As the guards pulled Richard away, he twisted his neck to glare at me one last time, his voice a hiss. "This is not over, Clara." But for me, it was. It was over in the only way that mattered. For the first time in my life, I was not his victim. I was his reckoning. The courtroom erupted when the sentence was read, not in cheers, but in a collective exhale, a release of tension that had built since the video first played. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, but all I saw was the relief on Mark's face, the way his shoulders sagged as if he had been carrying this burden too. I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the world buzzing with the story of the stepfather who tried to kill his stepdaughter for money and the daughter who survived and exposed him. The justice climax was not just a verdict, it was a declaration to every person who had ever been told to stay silent, to keep family business in the family, to endure abuse in the name of loyalty. My story had become proof that silence was the weapon of abusers, and truth was the weapon of the abused. For me, it was both an ending and a beginning, the climax of years of suffering and the start of something I had not felt in so long: freedom. The days after the sentencing felt surreal, as if I were waking up in a new life that had always existed just out of reach, but I carried the scars to remind me that freedom had not come cheaply. Richard's downfall was not confined to the walls of the prison that swallowed him. It spilled into every corner of his carefully cultivated life. The man who once walked through town with his chest puffed out and his charm polished to perfection was now reduced to a headline, a cautionary tale, a disgraced predator. Local newspapers plastered his mugshot across their front pages. Neighbors whispered his name with venom. Parents who once laughed at his jokes now crossed the street to avoid him. 20 years in prison was the sentence, but the true punishment was the permanent stain on his name, the rotting of the reputation he had spent decades pretending to build. Evelyn's fall was quieter but no less brutal. Though she avoided a prison sentence, she could not avoid the judgment of a community that had watched the trial unfold in detail. People looked at her not with pity but with disgust, mothers shaking their heads, fathers muttering under their breath. How could a mother stand by while her child was pushed to death? Invitations dried up. Friends disappeared. Even her own siblings stopped answering her calls. She was left alone in the house she had once filled with Richard's laughter, a ghost among empty rooms, her loyalty to him a noose that had strangled her future. For me, the consequences were not measured in their suffering, but in the release of my own chains. The inheritance that Richard had tried to steal was finally transferred into my hands without contest. The coastal house my father had loved, the land that had been his pride, became mine, not as a possession to flaunt, but as a shield, a reminder that his legacy had survived the storm. I walked through the halls of that house with a strange mixture of grief and triumph, touching the walls he had painted, standing on the porch where he had once held me, and I whispered, "I made it, Dad, I kept it." But consequences are not only measured in legal terms or property deeds, they live in the lives of those who remain. Richard's daughter from a previous marriage, a girl I barely knew, wrote me a letter from across the country. In shaky handwriting, she said she was sorry that she had believed his lies, that she too had suffered under his control. Reading her words, I realized his downfall had set others free as well, that my fight had not been just for me, but for anyone trapped under the shadow of men like him. The town did not forget quickly. Every grocery store line, every gas station visit, I felt the eyes of strangers who knew my story. Some offered nods of respect. Others whispered their support. A few hugged me with tears in their eyes, saying, "You are so brave. I could never have done what you did." At first, their words felt heavy, as if bravery was a costume I had accidentally put on. But over time, I realized bravery is not about being unafraid. It is about refusing to die in silence. Richard's life inside prison was stripped of the power he once wielded. I heard through official updates that he struggled to adjust, that the same charm he used to manipulate neighbors and family meant nothing behind bars. There, his name was a curse, his crime unforgivable even among criminals. He was mocked, isolated, reduced to the weak man he had always been beneath the mask. That knowledge did not bring me joy, but it brought closure. Evelyn's downfall was slower, a quiet erosion rather than a collapse. She tried to reach out to me, letters filled with excuses and half-hearted apologies, but every word dripped with the same refusal to admit the truth. She wrote, "I was scared, Clara. I did not know what to do, but the video told a different story. It showed her standing still while I was shoved to my death. I never replied. The consequence of her silence was my silence in return. I let her fade into the emptiness she had chosen. The clearest consequence was within myself. For years I had walked with hunched shoulders, afraid of shadows, doubting my own reality. Now I walked straighter. The nightmare still came, flashes of falling, the sound of Richard's voice echoing. It is all ours now. But each time I woke up, I reminded myself he was caged, his power broken, his plan destroyed. Healing was not instant, it was not clean, but it was real. I began to use my inheritance not just to rebuild my life, but to build something larger. I contacted organizations for survivors of domestic abuse. I donated to shelters, and eventually I began to host meetings at the Coastal House, turning the place that had been marked for my death into a sanctuary for others. Watching women and men sit in my living room sharing their stories, their scars, their battles, I felt the ripple of consequence stretching far beyond Richard's cell. His attempt to erase me had created a wave of truth and resistance he could never contain. Consequences were everywhere: in his prison sentence, in Evelyn's isolation, in the whispers of the town, in the strength I finally claimed, but most of all in the knowledge that the cycle had been broken. My father's legacy had not been stolen, my voice had not been silenced, and Richard's reign of control was over. That was the true downfall, not just of one man, but of the silence that had protected him. 6 months after the trial, I stood on the same cliff where Richard had tried to end me. The wind sharp against my face, the ocean still raging below. But instead of fear filling my chest, I felt a strange calm. The scars on my palms ached as I gripped the railing, the memory of falling never far, but the difference now was that I stood by choice, not by force. The cliff was no longer just the place of my near death, it was the place of my rebirth. Healing did not arrive in a sudden rush. It came slowly, unevenly, like waves carving stone. Some nights I woke drenched in sweat, the echo of his voice in my ears. But in the morning I reminded myself again and again that his threats were behind bars, that he could not touch me. Therapy became a lifeline. The first time in my life I spoke openly without fear of being told I was exaggerating. I poured out years of silence, every bruise, every word of gaslighting, every betrayal by Evelyn. The therapist listened, nodded, and said words I had never heard before. "You are not crazy. You were abused, and surviving does not make you dramatic. It makes you strong." For the first time, I believed it. The inheritance I received did more than secure my future. It gave me a platform to build something meaningful. I converted part of the Coastal House into a community center, a safe space for survivors of domestic violence and family betrayal. We met weekly people sitting in the same living room where I once dreamed of escape, sharing their stories. Some cried, some shouted, some sat in silence, but every one of them left with a little less weight than they came in with. Each story reminded me I was not alone, that Richard was not unique, that silence had destroyed too many lives. My center became a place of light, carved out of years of darkness. Reporters came, cameras clicked, but this time I welcomed the attention. Not as a victim on display, but as a survivor, telling others you can break the cycle. Evelyn's letters still came occasionally, filled with half apologies, pleas to reconnect. but I never opened them anymore. Healing meant recognizing that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation, that I could let go of hatred without letting her back into my life. She had chosen Richard over me, and that choice was hers to live with. Richard, I heard, struggled in prison, his charm useless, his arrogance punished, in a way that was justice enough, not because I wished him suffering, but because the mask he had worn all his life had finally been stripped away. He was no longer a man others respected, he was simply an inmate with a number. Healing meant accepting that his downfall was not mine to manage, it was his to endure. My closure came not from his pain, but from my freedom. On the anniversary of my father's death, I held a gathering at the house. Friends, neighbors, survivors, all together. We lit candles along the porch, the same place where my father once told me the world is bigger than your fears. I spoke to them, my voice clear, telling them my story not as tragedy, but as proof. I told them Richard tried to kill me for greed, that my mother stood by in silence, that I had been told to shut up for years. And then I told them about the climb, the refusal to die, the proof captured on video, the trial, the sentence. I told them that the greatest healing was realizing that silence had never protected me, only the truth had. The crowd listened, some with tears, some with fire in their eyes. At the end, I asked the question that had become my mantra, the same one I now ask you: did I go too far or not far enough? The murmur of voices rose, some saying you did exactly what you had to do, others shaking their heads at the cruelty of family, but all of them understood the heart of it. The message was simple. Family is not defined by blood when blood tries to kill you. Family is defined by who stands beside you when the cliff opens beneath your feet. Healing meant rewriting what family meant to me, choosing my circle, not by obligation, but by trust. Mark became more than a childhood friend. He became a brother in all the ways Richard never was, his recording, not only saving my life, but reminding me that someone cared enough to act. Together, we built the center together. We made sure no one else in town would suffer in silence. My father's voice still lingers when the wind howls across the cliffs, but now it is not a haunting. It is a reminder. He left me more than property. He left me resilience. They tried to erase me, but I endured, and by enduring, I won. The final closure came when I returned to court one last time, not for a hearing, but for the restitution payments Richard had been ordered to make. As the check was handed to me, money meant to repay the damages of my near death. I smiled, not because of the number, but because of the irony. Richard had shouted, "It is all ours now," but in the end, everything he had fought for, everything he had tried to steal, was gone, funneled back to me. His greed had destroyed him and rebuilt me. Standing on that cliff today, I breathe in the salt air and let the wind whip through my hair. No longer a victim, no longer a daughter, silenced. I am Clara Henderson, survivor, heir to my father's legacy, destroyer of the silence that almost killed me. And to everyone watching, to everyone who has lived with abuse, I say this: you do not have to let go to fall. You can climb back. You can fight, and when you fight with the truth, you will win.